Hidden among the quiet paths of Queens' St. John Cemetery lie the graves of some of the most powerful and feared mobsters in American history. Men who once ruled New York's underworld, now resting beneath these stones. Today, we're visiting 5 infamous gangsters buried right here at St. John Cemetery.
I won't run from the storm. I arrive after it.
Charles "Lucky" Luciano was one of the most influential figures in the history of organized crime. Often called the father of the modern American Mafia, Luciano transformed the chaotic gang wars of the early 20th century into a structured criminal organization. Luciano was born November 24th, 1897, in Sicily, and immigrated to New York City as a child. Growing up on the Lower East Side, he became involved in street gangs and formed relationships with young criminals who would later become powerful mob figures. During the late 1920s, New York's underworld was dominated by 2 rival bosses, Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Their violent conflict, known as the Castellammarese War, left the city's mafia families locked in constant bloodshed. Luciano believed the old system was outdated. In 1931, he secretly arranged the assassination of Joe Masseria, then later helped eliminate Maranzano as well. After the war ended, Luciano reorganized the mafia structure in America. Instead of a single boss controlling everything, he created the 5 families of New York and established the Mafia Commission, a governing council designed to prevent future wars. This system allowed organized crime to operate like a business network rather than a battlefield. Although Luciano later went to prison on prostitution charges in 1936, his organizational blueprint remained the foundation of the American Mafia for decades. Luciano died in 1962, but his influence on organized crime is still considered one of the most important in Mafia history. In the end, Lucky Luciano left behind a legacy that permanently reshaped organized crime in the United States. While many gangsters of his era relied on brute force and endless gang wars, Luciano understood that the future of the Mafia depended on structure, cooperation, and business-like discipline. The system he helped create, the network of the 5 families and the ruling commission, allowed organized crime to operate with unprecedented power for decades. Even long after his death in 1962, the influence of Luciano's ideas could still be seen in the way mafia families organized themselves, proving that while the man himself was gone, the criminal empire he helped design continued to endure. Carlo Gambino became one of the most powerful mafia bosses in American history. Born August 24th, 1902, in Palermo, Sicily, Gambino came from a family with strong mafia connections. He illegally entered the United States in 1921 and quickly became involved in organized crime in Brooklyn. Gambino rose through the ranks during the early years of the Mafia's new structure, created by Lucky Luciano. In 1957, a major turning point occurred when Gambino helped orchestrate the assassination of crime boss Albert Anastasia inside a Manhattan barbershop. Following Anastasia's death, Gambino quietly became the leader of the organization that would soon bear his name, the Gambino crime family. Unlike flashy mob bosses, Gambino preferred to stay out of the spotlight. He dressed modestly, avoided nightclubs, and conducted most of his business quietly from social clubs and private meetings. Under his leadership, the Gambino family became deeply involved in labor union racketeering, construction industry, corruption, gambling operations, loan sharking, cargo theft. Because of his cautious leadership style, Gambino managed to rule for nearly 20 years without serving major prison time. When he died in 1976, he left behind one of the most powerful mafia organizations in the country. Vito Genovese was another central figure in the development of the American Mafia. Born in 1897 in Naples, Italy, Genovese immigrated to New York as a teenager and became involved in organized crime during the early Prohibition era. He worked closely with Lucky Luciano and helped build the early mafia structure in New York. However, Genovese was known for being extremely ambitious. In the late 1930s, he fled to Italy after being charged with murder in the United States. While living under the regime of Benito Mussolini, he reportedly maintained connections with criminal networks. After World War II, Genovese returned to the United States and resumed his involvement in organized crime. By the 1950s, he had become one of the most powerful mafia leaders in the country. In 1957, he attempted to consolidate power over the mafia, but his growing influence alarmed rival bosses and law enforcement. Later that year, the famous Appalachian Meeting, a gathering of mafia leaders in upstate New York, was raided by police, exposing the existence of a nationwide criminal organization. Soon after, Genovese was convicted of narcotics trafficking and sentenced to prison. He died behind bars in 1969, but the crime family he led still bears his name today. While Roy DeMeo was already known as a dangerous enforcer within the Gambino crime family, his true rise to power came through his ability to generate massive profits for the mafia. DeMeo became closely aligned with Gambino underboss Neil Della Croce, who valued earners that could bring in steady money. DeMeo built one of the largest international stolen car rings in the United States during the 1970s. His crew would steal luxury vehicles, Cadillacs, Lincolns, Mercedes, and ship them overseas to the Middle East through contacts at shipping docks in New Jersey and New York. The operation reportedly generated millions of dollars a year, making DeMeo extremely valuable to the Gambino leadership despite his violent reputation. But DeMeo's criminal empire was built not just on money, but on fear. His crew operated out of the Gemini Lounge, a small neighborhood bar in Brooklyn that investigators later described as one of the most infamous murder sites in mafia history. Inside a back room of the bar, victims were executed using what became known as the Gemini method, a process designed to kill quickly and dispose of bodies without leaving evidence. Law enforcement later estimated that DeMeo's crew could have been responsible for over 100 murders, making it one of the deadliest organized crime groups ever uncovered in New York. By the early 1980s, however, DeMeo's extreme violence began creating problems for the mafia itself. Federal investigators were closing in on the crew, and several associates were already under intense surveillance. Gambino boss Paul Castellano reportedly grew increasingly concerned that DeMeo might eventually be arrested and become an informant. In January 1983, DeMeo disappeared. Soon afterward, his body was discovered in the trunk of his own car in Brooklyn, riddled with bullets. Authorities believe he was murdered by members of his own organization, a grim but common fate in the world of organized crime, where loyalty often ended the moment someone became a liability. Today, Roy DeMeo remains one of the most chilling figures in mafia history. His story illustrates both the enormous profits and the extreme violence that defined organized crime during the 1970s and early 1980s. Even within the brutal culture of the mafia, DeMeo's reputation for ruthless efficiency made him a figure that many gangsters themselves feared. While John Gotti eventually became the most famous mob boss in America, his rise in organized crime was built over decades inside the street-level operations of the Gambino crime family. Growing up in East New York, Brooklyn, Gotti quickly became involved in street gangs and criminal activity. By his early 20s, he was working with the crew of Gambino captain Carmine Fatico, operating out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. This small social club served as headquarters for a group of mobsters heavily involved in truck hijacking, loan sharking, and gambling operations. Gotti's bold personality and willingness to take risks helped him quickly gain influence within the crew. During the 1970s, Gotti and his associates became particularly successful in cargo hijacking operations at John F. Kennedy International Airport, where valuable shipments could be stolen and resold for huge profits. One of the most famous incidents connected to his crew was the 1973 hijacking of an Air France cargo shipment which contained millions of dollars worth of valuables. The robbery became one of the largest airport thefts of its time and greatly increased Gotti's reputation inside the mafia. However, the robbery also led to his arrest and conviction, and he served several years in federal prison. When Gotti was released, he returned to the Gambino organization, just as tensions were rising between the traditional street faction and the leadership of Gambino boss Paul Castellano. Castellano focused heavily on white-collar rackets and corporate-style crime operations, while Gotti and many street-level gangsters believed the boss had become disconnected from the everyday workings of the family. The death of Gambino underboss Neil Della Croce in December 1985 removed the one man who had balanced these competing factions. Just 2 weeks later, Gotti made his move. On December the 16th, 1985, Castellano and his associate Thomas Bellotti were ambushed outside Sparks Steakhouse in one of the most famous mob hits ever carried out in New York City. With Castellano dead, Gotti quickly took control of the Gambino crime family and soon became a national media sensation. Unlike previous mafia leaders who avoided publicity, Gotti embraced the spotlight. His expensive suits, confident courtroom appearances, and constant presence in front of television cameras earned him the nickname the Dapper Don. After several acquittals in high-profile trials during the late 1980s, newspapers began calling him the Teflon Don because charges seemed unable to stick to him. However, the attention he attracted ultimately helped bring about his downfall. Federal investigators secretly placed listening devices inside the Ravenite Social Club, where Gotti regularly held meetings with associates. These recordings captured him discussing criminal activities and criticizing members of his own organization. His underboss, Sammy Gravano, eventually agreed to testify against him in exchange for a reduced sentence. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted of multiple crimes, including murder, racketeering, and conspiracy, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died in 2002 while incarcerated, but his larger-than-life personality and a dramatic rise and fall made him one of the most recognizable figures in mafia history. Even decades later, the story of John Gotti continues to symbolize the final era, when organized crime bosses could become celebrities while still ruling powerful criminal empires. This was Volume 1 of Notorious Mobsters, laid to rest at St. John Cemetery. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed another video from Tales from the Tombs and Jay.